In the spring of 1989, in a small farmhouse outside Tulsa, Oklahoma, a 73-year-old man named Roy Caldwell was dying. Not quickly, not dramatically. The way a candle burns down to its last inch of wax, still giving light, still warm, but running out of the thing that keeps it lit. His heart was failing. The doctors said weeks, maybe a month. His son James sat beside the bed most afternoons watching his father sleep, listening to the monitors beep their slow mechanical rhythm, and trying not to think about the silence that was coming. On the bedside table next to a glass of water and a bottle of pills sat a small glass jar with a metal screw lid. The jar was filled with white crystals, salt, ordinary table salt. On the glass in handwriting that had faded over 4 decades but remained legible were 5 words and a name: Fritz Camp Concordia, 1944. Simple works. James had seen that jar his entire life. It sat on the kitchen shelf when he was a boy next to the flour canister and the coffee tin. It moved to his father's study when James left for college. And now it sat beside a dying man's bed, close enough to touch, as if whatever was inside that jar mattered more than the pills and the water and the machines. One afternoon, James picked up the jar and turned it in the light. "Dad, why do you keep a jar of salt by your bed?" Roy Caldwell opened his eyes. They were cloudy now, but something behind them was still sharp, still present. He looked at the jar in his son's hand and smiled. Not a big smile, the kind that lives more in the eyes than the mouth, because that jar taught me more about medicine than 18 months of military training. James looked at the jar, looked at his father. Salt Roy's voice was thin but steady. "Not just salt. A 19-year-old German prisoner of war taught me how to save 23 lives with nothing but salt water and clean cloth. I was his enemy. He was mine. And he became the best teacher I ever had." James waited for more, but Roy closed his eyes and drifted back into the shallow sleep of the very ill. The jar sat on the table, catching the Oklahoma afternoon light, holding its secret the way salt holds everything. Quietly, completely, for as long as it takes. Roy Caldwell died 11 days later. James inherited the jar. He did not yet understand what it meant. But he would, in time. Across an ocean, in half a century, the jar would lead him to a kitchen in Bavaria, where the answer had been waiting since before he was born. But that is the end of the story. And to understand the end, we need to go back to the beginning. Back 45 years, to the summer of 1944. To the flat Kansas prairie where wheat fields stretched to the horizon on both sides of the barbed wire, and a young American medic stood in a small clinic watching men lose their legs because he did not have the medicine to save them. To understand how an American farm boy from Oklahoma and a German farm boy from Bavaria ended up changing military medicine with a pot of salt water, we need to start with the man who almost let it happen, the man who almost walked away, the man who on one August evening in 1944 stood outside a captain's door for 5 minutes with his hand on the doorknob and nearly chose silence over courage. His name was Roy Caldwell, and this is his story. Camp Concordia sat on the flat Kansas prairie like a small city made of wood and wire. Row after row of whitewashed barracks stretched behind fences, topped with barbed wire, and beyond the fences, wheat fields ran to the horizon in every direction. Golden, endless, rolling under the summer wind like the surface of a slow, warm ocean. In July 1944, the camp held approximately 4,000 German prisoners of war. Most had been captured in North Africa during the fall of the Afrika Korps or during the Allied invasion of Sicily and Italy in 1943. They were soldiers without a war now, farmers without land, men waiting for something none of them could name. Sergeant Roy Caldwell stood at the window of the camp medical clinic and watched the wheat move. He was 28 years old, lean and sunburned, with the kind of hands that knew their way around both a stethoscope and a hay bale. Before the Army took him, Roy was a farmer in eastern Oklahoma, grew wheat mostly, some cattle. He woke before dawn, worked until his shirt was dark with sweat, and ate supper at a table where his mother said grace and his father said nothing because the food said enough. Roy trained as a medic because he was good with his hands and patient with pain. 18 months of military medical training at Camp Barkley, Texas, wound care, triage, field surgery basics, infection management. He learned to stop bleeding, set bones, read the signs of shock in a man's face before the man himself knew he was dying. He was good at it, better than good. His instructors said he had a feel for it the way some men have a feel for horses or engines or the weather. Roy Caldwell could look at a wound and know things about it that took other medics twice as long to figure out. He expected to be sent to the front. France, Italy, the Pacific, somewhere where his training would matter, where men were bleeding and he could help. Instead, the Army sent him to Camp Concordia, Kansas, guard duty at a prisoner of war camp, medical support for 4,000 German prisoners who were not bleeding, not dying, not doing anything except harvesting wheat and waiting for the war to end. Roy understood the logic. He hated it, but he understood it. Medics were needed everywhere and camps needed medical staff just like field hospitals did. The Geneva Convention required it. Prisoners had to receive adequate medical care. Someone had to provide that care. And Roy Caldwell, farm boy from Oklahoma, was that someone. He did his job well because that was who he was. He treated every prisoner with the same careful attention he would have given his own brother. He called every patient son. German prisoners, twice his age, young men barely out of childhood, it did not matter. Everyone was son. It was a habit his mother would have recognized. The habit of a man who believes that hurting bodies do not carry passports. But behind the competence, behind the steady hands and the gentle voice, Roy Caldwell carried a frustration that grew heavier with every passing week. He was a healer trapped in a place where he could not fully heal. His medicine cabinet was half empty. Antibiotics, the most critical tool for fighting infection, were rationed to combat forces fighting across France after D-Day. Camp Concordia received the scraps. Roy submitted request after request for additional supplies. Denied, denied, denied. Priority goes to combat forces. The stamp on the rejection letters was always the same shade of red, and after the third one, Roy stopped being surprised and started being angry. But Roy Caldwell had a flaw that his anger could not overcome. He avoided conflict. When the system said no, Roy accepted no. He grumbled. He complained to Captain Whitmore over coffee. He wrote strongly worded requests that used the word urgent in capital letters. But he did not fight. He did not walk into the supply office and pound his fist on the desk. He did not go over anyone's head. He did not make himself a problem that someone had to solve. Roy Caldwell was a good man who followed rules, and that was both his greatest strength and the thing that almost cost 23 men their legs. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from today. Are you here in the United States? Are you watching from Germany or Canada or somewhere else entirely? We love knowing who is listening to these stories that history almost forgot. The other weight Roy carried was personal. His younger brother, Private Tommy Caldwell, was somewhere in the Pacific, fighting the Japanese on islands whose names Roy could barely pronounce. Tommy was 23, skinny, loud, the kind of kid who laughed at his own jokes before the punchline and somehow made everyone laugh with him. Tommy enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor. He did not wait for the draft. He walked into the recruiting office in Tulsa with his boots still dirty from the farm and said, "I am ready, sir. Point me at them." Roy had not received a letter from Tommy in 4 months. 4 months of silence. 4 months of checking the mail every afternoon at the camp post office, flipping through envelopes addressed to other men, finding nothing with Tommy's handwriting. 4 months of writing letters to an address in the Pacific that might not exist anymore, saying things like stay low, eat your vegetables, and do not do anything stupid, which was Roy's way of saying I love you because Caldwell, men did not say I love you. They said useful things and hoped the meaning traveled between the words. Every night before sleep, Roy whispered the same 3 words into the dark of his quarters. Stay alive, Tommy. But Tommy did not answer, and the silence grew louder every day. On Sunday afternoons, the off-duty American soldiers at Camp Concordia played baseball in the open field between the guard barracks and the fence line. The crack of bat against ball carried across the flat Kansas air like a gunshot, followed by shouts and laughter, and the particular joy of young men doing something that reminded them of home. Roy sometimes stood at the clinic window and watched. The game was sloppy, more enthusiasm than skill. Private Bobby Wells from Georgia played shortstop with the intensity of a man defending his homeland and the accuracy of a man who had never successfully thrown anything in a straight line in his life. Beyond the fence, German prisoners watched. Some stood near the wire with their arms crossed, studying the game with the baffled concentration of men trying to understand a foreign religion. Baseball made no sense to them. The rules were incomprehensible. The purpose was unclear. But they watched anyway because watching Americans play a game they loved was more interesting than staring at barracks walls. One afternoon, Wells noticed a German prisoner standing closer to the fence than usual. A tall young man with an easy smile and restless energy, the kind of man who could not stand still for more than 30 seconds without fidgeting. His name was Dieter Voss, 22 years old, captured in Sicily. Before the war, a carpenter in Heidelberg. Dieter had a laugh that could fill a barracks, in a habit of trying to communicate in broken English, that was enthusiastic, creative, and almost entirely wrong. Wells jogged over to the fence, grinning, and held up the bat. "You want to try? Fritz." Fritz was what the Americans called all German prisoners, regardless of actual name. Dieter did not mind. He grinned back and shrugged with the exaggerated confidence of a man who has no idea what he is doing but refuses to admit it. Wells tossed the bat over the fence. Dieter caught it, examined it, and gripped it the way a man grips an axe when he is about to split firewood. Both hands at the top, blade aimed straight down. Wells shook his head. "No, no, hold it here. Swing across, like this." Wells demonstrated a swing from outside the fence. Dieter nodded seriously, adjusted his grip by approximately 2 degrees, and swung the bat from overhead like he was chopping a log. The bat hit the ground with a thud that sent a puff of Kansas dust into the air. Dieter stumbled forward, caught himself, and looked at the bat with genuine betrayal, as if the bat had personally deceived him. The Americans howled. The prisoners behind Dieter covered their mouths, but their shoulders shook. Wells was bent, double hands on his knees. "Brother," Dieter said in his careful broken English, "in Germany, we hit with axe." "Same thing, yes." Wells wiped his eyes. "It is absolutely not the same thing." Dieter tried again. This time he swung sideways but released the bat at the peak of his swing. It flew through the air and nearly hit a guard tower. Wells dove behind the fence post. The watching prisoners scattered. Dieter stood with empty hands and a face of pure innocence. Roy Caldwell watched from the clinic window and felt something strange move through his chest. Something between laughter and grief. Two sides of a war laughing together over a baseball bat. The world made no sense at all. And in the middle of the nonsense, for a few seconds, the weight of Tommy's silence in the empty medicine cabinet and the frustration of being a healer without tools lifted just enough for Roy to breathe. But Roy noticed something else during those weeks of watching, something that had nothing to do with baseball. Among the thousands of prisoners who moved through Camp Concordia, Roy's medic eyes were drawn to one man. Not the loudest, not the most visible. The opposite. Friedrich Lehmann was 19 years old, captured in Sicily in 1943, and he was quite possibly the quietest human being Roy Caldwell had ever encountered. Friedrich moved through the camp like a shadow with good posture. He worked the farm details without complaint. He ate his meals in silence. He spoke only when spoken to, and even then his answers were so brief that the interpreter sometimes had to ask if he had actually finished talking. But Friedrich did one thing that made Roy's medical instincts sit up and pay attention. Friedrich washed his hands before every meal. Every single meal, without exception. Even when water was scarce. Even when other prisoners laughed at him for wasting precious rations on something as pointless as clean hands. Friedrich walked to the washing station, scrubbed his hands with the focused intensity of a surgeon preparing for an operation, dried them on whatever clean cloth he could find, and only then sat down to eat. Roy had been trained to notice hygiene habits. In medical school, before you learn to cut, before you learn to stitch, before you learn anything else, you learn to wash your hands. It is the first lesson and the most important one. And Roy recognized that habit in Friedrich, the way a musician recognizes another musician across a crowded room. Not by what they say, by what they do with their hands. That boy knows something, Roy thought. He did not yet know what. He did not yet know how much it would matter. But the thought lodged itself in his mind like a seed in good soil, and it waited. But what Roy did not know was that the man who would teach him the most important lesson of his medical career was hiding that knowledge behind a wall of fear. And the wall had a name that Roy would not learn until much later. A name that belonged to a man sleeping in the last bunk at the far end of Barracks 14, a man who had already decided that silence was the only form of loyalty that mattered. If stories about the ordinary Americans who did extraordinary things during World War II matter to you, subscribe to this channel. We are dedicated to finding the stories that the history books left out. Stories about farm boys from Oklahoma and farm boys from Bavaria who discovered that healing has no nationality. The next part of Roy Caldwell's story is about to get much harder and much more important. The infections began in late July. The prisoners worked 10-hour days on the farm details during harvest season. Temperatures reached over 100 degrees. The Kansas sun baked the ground until the soil cracked and the dust rose with every step, fine as flour getting into everything. Eyes, lungs, clothes, and wounds, especially wounds. The prisoners wore boots that had been issued months or years ago. Boots that had marched across North Africa and Sicily and the decks of transport ships. Boots that were cracked at the seams, worn through at the soles, and held together with improvised patches of cloth and wire and hope. The combination of heat, sweat, friction from broken leather and that fine Kansas dust created conditions that were perfect for one thing: infection. It started small, the way it always starts: blisters that ruptured, cuts from harvesting equipment, places where boot leather rubbed skin raw. Roy treated them with standard protocol: clean with antiseptic, apply antibiotic ointment if available. Bandage, send the prisoner back to work. But antibiotic ointment was not available, not enough of it. Roy used what little he had on the worst cases and sent everyone else back with clean bandages and nothing more. And he told himself the wounds would heal on their own. Because most wounds do. Because the human body is remarkably good at fighting infection when given even a small chance. Because Roy needed to believe that clean bandages and hope were enough, because clean bandages and hope were all he had. The wounds did not heal. By the first week of August 23, prisoners had severe infections. Roy watched the numbers climb, the way a farmer watches a river rise during flood season, knowing what is coming, unable to stop it. Day 1, 3 men, day 3, 7, day 5, 12, day 8, 18, day 12, 23. Each day the number grew, and each day the infections deepened. Red skin turned redder. Swelling spread upward from ankles toward knees. Heat radiated from infected tissue like small furnaces burning beneath the surface. Roy checked and rechecked and changed bandages and cleaned wounds and wrote in his charts with handwriting that got smaller and tighter as the situation got worse. He kept his voice calm when he spoke to the prisoners. Steady, reassuring. You will be fine, son. We are taking care of it. But behind the calm voice, Roy was doing math. 23 infected men, dwindling antibiotic supply, no resupply coming, wounds getting worse by the day. The math did not work. Something was going to give, and the something was going to be someone's leg. The smell in the clinic changed. Roy noticed it the way a farmer notices the first smell of rain before a storm. Under the usual smell of antiseptic and clean gauze, something else crept in. Something sweet and heavy and wrong. The smell of tissue that was beginning to lose its fight. Roy had smelled that smell before during training exercises with simulated casualties. But simulated casualties did not look at you with real eyes and ask real questions in a language you could not speak. Captain Douglas Whitmore was the camp physician. 42 years old, civilian doctor drafted into military service. Before the war, Whitmore was a family physician in a small Kansas town not far from Camp Concordia. He delivered babies and set broken bones and prescribed aspirin for headaches and told farmers to eat more vegetables and less bacon, advice that was universally ignored because Kansas farmers considered bacon a constitutional right. The war turned him into a prison camp doctor, a role he neither wanted nor understood but performed with quiet competence and a habit of tapping his pen against the desk when he was thinking hard about something. The prisoners learned to recognize that sound. When Whitmore tapped, it meant something was wrong. And Whitmore was tapping now. He examined all 23 infected prisoners over 2 days. Roy stood beside him, handing instruments, taking notes, watching Whitmore's face for the signals that medical professionals learn to read in each other. The slight tightening of the jaw that means this is worse than I expected. The extra second of silence before speaking, that means I am choosing my words carefully. The tap, tap, tap of the pen that means the math does not work, and I know it. Whitmore made his assessment. Several prisoners were at risk of sepsis, the condition where infection enters the bloodstream and attacks the entire body. At least 3 might require amputation if the infections continued to spread. Dieter Voss was one of the 3. Whitmore needed to transfer the critical cases to a military hospital 200 miles away. But arranging transport for prisoners of war required paperwork, approvals, vehicles, and armed escorts. 5 to 7 days minimum. For some of these men, 5 to 7 days was a lifetime they might not have. That evening, Roy sat alone in the clinic after hours. The overhead light hummed. The radio on the shelf played low, a Glenn Miller tune drifting through the empty room like a ghost of a happier time. Roy stared at the wound charts spread across his desk and did the math one more time. 23 men, no antibiotics, transport in 5 to 7 days, at least 3 facing amputation. The numbers had not changed. They were not going to change. And Roy felt the particular helplessness of a man who was trained to heal and placed in a position where healing was not possible. He thought about Dieter Voss gripping a baseball bat like a lumberjack's axe and swinging at invisible logs. He thought about the words Dieter had spoken through Corporal Henry Strauss, the camp interpreter, during his examination that morning. "Sergeant, I am a carpenter. I build tables and chairs and cabinets. I need 2 legs to stand at my workbench. Please do not let them take my legs." Roy had said, "You will keep both legs, son." And he meant it, and he did not know how to make it true. Then a knock on the clinic door interrupted his thoughts. Private Bobby Wells stood in the doorway holding 2 glass bottles of Coca-Cola condensation running down the sides, ice still clinking inside. "You look like a man who needs something with bubbles in it, Sarge." Roy took the bottle, opened it. The familiar hiss filled the quiet room. He took a long drink and felt the cold sweetness hit his throat, and for exactly 3 seconds, the world was just a man and a bottle of Coca-Cola and nothing else. Wells sat down on the examination table, which was technically against regulations, but Wells had a talent for making everything he did seem like it was probably fine. "My mama always said Coca-Cola fixes everything except a broken tractor and a broken heart. And even then it helps some." Roy laughed. It was a short sound, more like a cough, that decided to be happy at the last second. But it was genuine, and for a moment the weight lifted. Just a moment. Just enough. Then Whitmore opened the clinic door. His face was drawn. The pen was in his hand, but he was not tapping it. He was holding it still, which was worse. "Caldwell, I need to talk to you about Voss. His infection has accelerated. If we do not find a way to control it within 5 to 7 days, we will be discussing amputation. And he is not the only one." Wells quietly took his Coca-Cola and left. The clinic door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded to Roy's ears like a countdown beginning. Roy stood alone with Whitmore in the charts, in the humming light, in the fading sound of Glenn Miller on the radio. And he felt time running out the way you feel sand running through your fingers. Not all at once. Grain by grain, each grain a man's leg, each grain a promise Roy could not keep. But Roy did not know that the answer to his problem was sleeping 40 yards away in Barracks 14. Locked inside the memory of a boy who had been taught by his grandmother that salt takes away the bad. But that answer was also locked behind something else. Behind fear, behind loyalty, behind a man named Otto Kessler, whose rules kept 40 men in line and whose grief kept one man silent. The answer was coming, but it would not come easily. And when it came, it would force Roy Caldwell to make a choice that no amount of medical training had prepared him for. The choice between following the rules and saving lives. The choice between being a good soldier and being a good man. The choice that would define the rest of his life and echo across 2 families, 2 countries, and 53 years. That choice was 6 days away, and the clock was already running. To understand what happened next, we need to leave Roy Caldwell's clinic for a moment and step inside Barracks 14. Not through the front door where the American guards stood watch during the day and the overhead lights revealed every corner in flat institutional brightness. We need to enter the way secrets enter. Through the dark. Through the hours between midnight and dawn, when the barracks held nothing but the breathing of 40 men and the thin Kansas moonlight coming through windows that were never fully clean. In the last bunk at the far end of Barracks 14, a man named Otto Kessler lay awake every night and listened. Kessler was 34 years old, a career soldier, Feldwebel, captured at Tunisia in May 1943 with the remnants of Rommel's Afrika Korps. He had fought across North Africa for 2 years, survived British artillery, American airstrikes, desert heat that could kill a man in hours, and the slow starvation of supply lines that stretched thinner and thinner until they snapped like old rope. He was not a man who broke easily. He was not a man who broke at all. That was what everyone believed, and Kessler worked very hard to make sure they kept believing it. He ran Barracks 14 the way he had run his squad in the desert, with discipline, with order, with rules that everyone understood and no one questioned. The barracks was the cleanest in camp. Food rations were divided with mathematical precision. Disputes were settled quickly, fairly, and without raising voices. When American guards treated prisoners roughly, Kessler intervened, calmly, firmly. Citing the Geneva Convention provisions he had memorized word for word. The Americans respected him for this. The prisoners respected him more. But Kessler's discipline had a sharp edge that most men only discovered when they crossed it. Kessler believed in one thing above all else, the honor of the German soldier. And that honor, as Kessler defined it, meant absolute separation from the enemy. You worked on the farm details because the Americans forced you to. That was acceptable. You answered direct questions from guards because regulations required it. That was acceptable. But you did not volunteer information. You did not make friendly conversation. You did not laugh at their jokes or learn their games or accept their Coca-Cola or help their medical staff beyond the bare minimum required by the rules of captivity. Anyone who crossed that line was a collaborator. And Kessler would remember. He did not need to use threats. The weapon was subtler than that. Every man in Barracks 14 knew that someday the war would end and they would go home to Germany. And in Germany, the memory of collaboration would follow a man like a shadow. His family would be whispered about. His neighbors would look away. His future would carry a stain that no amount of time could wash clean. Kessler kept no written list, but every man understood that his behavior was being observed, cataloged, and stored in the Feldwebel's precise, unforgiving memory. The prisoners called it the silence law. Never out loud, never where Kessler could hear. But the name existed because the rule existed, and the rule existed because Kessler needed it to exist. And here is the thing that no one in the barracks knew. The thing that turned Kessler from a simple antagonist into something more complicated and more human. The silence law was not born from ideology. It was not born from cruelty. It was born from the desperate need of a man who had lost everything to hold on to the one thing he had left. Kessler kept a single photograph tucked inside his uniform jacket, his wife Ilse, and their daughter Lotte. 5 years old in the picture, wearing a white dress, squinting at the camera with the suspicious expression of a child who has been told to smile and does not see why. The photograph was taken in Hamburg in the spring of 1943, just before Kessler's capture. 3 months after that photograph was taken, the Royal Air Force launched Operation Gomorrah. For 8 days in late July 1943, British bombers dropped thousands of tons of incendiary bombs on Hamburg. The resulting firestorms killed over 37,000 civilians and destroyed much of the city. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to ash. Streets that had held shops and schools and homes became corridors of flame where the air itself burned. Kessler received no letters from Ilse after that. For 14 months, he did not know if his wife and daughter were alive or dead. He carried the photograph against his chest every day and looked at it every night before sleep. Lotte in her white dress, Ilse's hand on Lotte's shoulder. The garden behind them, green and ordinary, the kind of garden that exists in a world where bombs have not yet fallen. The not knowing ate at him. It ate through his patience, through his warmth, through every soft thing inside him until all that remained was structure, rules, control. Because if Kessler could not control whether Ilse and Lotte were breathing or buried, he could at least control this barracks. He could keep these men in order. He could maintain the discipline that kept them German, kept them soldiers, kept them from dissolving into the shapeless mass of defeated prisoners that the Americans seemed to want them to become. The silence law was not about the Americans. It was about Kessler trying to hold the world together with his bare hands, because the part of the world that mattered most to him might already be gone. But Friedrich Lehmann did not know any of this. He only knew that Kessler was watching, and that what Friedrich needed to do would violate Kessler's most sacred rule. The crisis inside Friedrich had been building for weeks. Every night, lying on his bunk in Barracks 14, Friedrich listened to his closest friend Dieter Voss moan softly on the bunk below. Not loudly. Dieter was not a complainer, just a low, steady sound of pain that threaded through the dark hours like a needle pulling thread through cloth. And between the moans, Dieter talked in his sleep. Fragments of words that floated up through the darkness like smoke. Workshop. Sawdust. 2 legs. Need 2 legs to stand at the saw bench. Mother's table. Not finished. Not finished. Friedrich lay awake and stared at the ceiling and thought about salt water. He thought about his grandmother, Hedwig Lehmann, a kitchen in Bavaria in 1934. Friedrich was 9 years old. He had fallen from a chestnut tree and ripped his leg open on a branch. His mother panicked the way mothers do, rushing for clean cloth and calling for the doctor who lived 4 kilometers away and would not arrive for an hour. His grandmother did not panic. Hedwig Lehmann had never panicked in her life. She was a woman built from the same materials the Bavarian hills, solid and patient and older than worry. Hedwig boiled water on the wood stove. She dissolved salt into the water handful by handful, tasting it with a wooden spoon until she nodded. She let it cool until it was warm against her wrist, but no longer hot. She dipped clean cloth strips into the solution and wrapped them around Friedrich's wound. Friedrich cried because the salt stung. 9-year-old boys cry when salt meets raw flesh. It is the most natural thing in the world. Hedwig held his hand and said 3 sentences that Friedrich would carry across the years, across the war, across the Atlantic Ocean, all the way to a wooden bunk in Kansas. Salt takes away the bad. Water carries the bad away. Cloth keeps the good in. In 3 days, the infection retreated. In 1 week, the wound healed. And Friedrich learned something that no school could have taught him: that the simplest things applied with knowledge and patience can defeat enemies that look invincible. Now, lying in the dark in Kansas listening to Dieter moan, Friedrich knew exactly what to do. He had known for weeks. Every time he walked past the camp kitchen and saw the large bag of salt sitting on the shelf next to the flour, he knew. Every time he watched Caldwell change bandages with nothing but clean gauze and the quiet frustration of a healer, without tools, he knew. The knowledge sat inside him like a stone in his chest, heavy, unavoidable, impossible to ignore, and impossible to use. Because between the knowledge and the action stood Otto Kessler and his silence law. To prepare salt water, Friedrich needed access to the kitchen and the outdoor stove. To treat the wounds, he needed to cooperate with the American medical system, at least indirectly. To save Dieter's legs, Friedrich needed to cross the line that Kessler had drawn in invisible ink across the floor of Barracks 14. And then the news arrived that shattered the wall between knowing and doing. It came through a prisoner named Karl Pfeiffer, newly transferred to Camp Concordia from another camp. Karl had served in the same division as Friedrich's father, Heinrich Lehmann. Karl recognized the family name and sought Friedrich out during a work break. What Karl told Friedrich that afternoon, standing in the shade of a hay barn, while Kansas dust swirled around them, changed the chemistry of Friedrich's fear. Heinrich Lehmann did not die in battle on the Eastern Front. That was what the family had been told. Killed in action, Eastern Front, 1943. But Karl had heard from another prisoner who had been held in the same Soviet camp that Heinrich was captured at Stalingrad in early 1943. He survived the initial captivity. He survived the march. He died in a Soviet prisoner of war camp in the winter of 1943. He died of an infected wound that was never treated. Friedrich stood in the shade of that barn and felt the world tilt beneath his feet. His father did not die from a bullet. His father died from infection. The same infection that was eating through the legs of 23 men in this camp right now. If someone in that Soviet camp had known how to boil water and dissolve salt, if someone had remembered what a grandmother taught them in a warm kitchen on a cold morning, if someone had chosen to act instead of staying silent, Heinrich Lehmann might still be alive. The grief hit Friedrich like a fist to the center of his chest. But beneath the grief, something else moved. Something harder and clearer and colder than grief. A recognition that was almost unbearable in its simplicity. His father died because no one acted. Dieter was losing his leg because Friedrich had not acted. And between the knowledge and the action stood one man's rules about what it meant to be loyal. Friedrich did not sleep that night. He lay on his bunk and listened to Dieter and thought about his father dying on a wooden floor in Russia, and heard his grandmother's voice, not a memory now, but a command coming from somewhere deeper than memory. Do not ever let an idea kill a person, Friedrich. Ideas do not know how to bleed. 3 days passed. 3 days of watching and failing to move. Day 1. Friedrich checked Dieter's wound after work. Worse, he walked past the kitchen, saw the salt, kept walking. Day 2. Another prisoner told Friedrich what the medics had said. If antibiotics did not arrive within 3 days, Dieter would lose his leg. Friedrich walked past the kitchen, stopped, looked at the salt, stood there for a full minute, kept walking. Day 3. Dieter's fever reached 39.5 degrees. Caldwell placed him on the emergency evacuation list, but the transport had not been approved. That evening, Friedrich sat on the edge of his bunk and watched Dieter sleep. Gray face, sweat on his forehead, lips moving. Workshop. 2 legs. Mother's table. At 1 in the morning, Friedrich climbed down from his bunk. He walked outside to the washing area behind the barracks and sat alone in the dark. The Kansas sky was enormous above him, wider and deeper than any sky he had seen in his life, thick with stars that looked exactly like the stars over Bavaria. The same stars, the same sky, the same universe looking down on a boy in Kansas and a grave in Russia and a kitchen in Bavaria, where an old woman once dissolved salt in boiling water and said 3 sentences that could save a man's legs. Friedrich heard his grandmother's voice one more time. Not the 3 sentences about salt, the other sentence, the one about ideas. He stood up. He walked back into the barracks. He woke Conrad Brandt, a quiet prisoner who slept 2 bunks away, with a hand on his shoulder and whispered 4 words. I need your help. Conrad looked at Friedrich for a long time in the dark. Then he nodded. They worked quickly. Conrad went to the kitchen and asked for salt, saying the men wanted to season their food. A friendly cook gave him a small bag without questions. Friedrich asked the night guard, Private Bobby Wells, for permission to use the small stove outside the barracks. He said the men wanted hot tea. Wells shrugged with the supreme indifference of a 20-year-old guard on the midnight shift and said 30 minutes. Friedrich boiled 2 pots of water. Steam rose into the Kansas night, carrying the sharp mineral smell of clean heat. He dissolved salt into the water, tasting it the way Hedwig had taught him. Salty as tears. That was the right concentration. Not saltier, not milder. Salty as the tears of a 9-year-old boy who fell from a chestnut tree and cried while his grandmother wrapped his leg and told him that the sting meant the salt was working. He let the solution cool until it was warm against his wrist. He tore clean cloth into strips. He carried the pot and the cloth back into the barracks. Friedrich knelt beside Dieter's bunk. The moonlight came through the window and laid a thin silver stripe across the floor. Friedrich's hands were steady now. The shaking had stopped. Something had settled inside him that was deeper than fear and stronger than doubt. The certainty of a man doing exactly what he was meant to do. He removed the old bandages from Dieter's leg. He dipped a cloth strip into the salt water. He laid it against the wound. Dieter winced in his sleep. A small sound escaped his lips. Friedrich whispered the words his grandmother had spoken 15 years ago in a kitchen 4,000 miles away. Salt takes away the bad. Water carries the bad away. Bear it for a moment, Dieter. Friedrich treated Dieter first, then Conrad, then 3 other prisoners who were awake and willing. 5 men total. He worked in the darkness by moonlight and memory. His hands moved with a precision that surprised him. Not a doctor's hands, a healer's hands. His grandmother's hands working through his. He finished at 4 in the morning. He rinsed the pot, hid it under his bunk, and collapsed onto his mattress with the exhausted satisfaction of honest work done in defiance of fear. The second night, he expanded to 10 patients. The third night, 15. The fourth night, 23. Every man in the barracks with an infected wound. His system was efficient now. Boil, dissolve, cool, soak, wrap, move to the next man, 2 hours from start to finish. Friedrich worked with the quiet precision of a carpenter building something important in a room where noise was not allowed. And the results were impossible to deny. On the first morning after treatment, the 5 men showed subtle but unmistakable improvement. Swelling down, redness fading, pain reduced. By the 3rd morning, Dieter Voss looked up at Friedrich with eyes that were bright for the first time in weeks and whispered something that Friedrich would carry for the rest of his life. I will stand at my workbench because of you, Fritz. I do not know how to say a bigger thing than that. But Friedrich was not the only one paying attention in the big hours of Barracks 14. On the 5th morning, the discovery came from the place Friedrich least expected. Not from Kessler, from Roy Caldwell. Morning sick call. The prisoners lined up outside the clinic the way they did every day, limping, wincing, holding bandaged legs, that told the story of a medical system failing in slow motion. Roy stood at the door, clipboard in hand, and began his examinations. And then he stopped. The first prisoner he checked, a man whose wound had been angry red and weeping 3 days ago, showed skin that was calmer, pink instead of crimson. Swelling reduced. Roy checked the next man, same improvement, and the next, and the next. He pulled out his notebook, the meticulous record he kept of every wound in the camp, and compared Monday's entries to Friday's entries. The improvement was medically impossible given the treatments the clinic had provided, which amounted to clean bandages and nothing more. Roy stood in the clinic and felt his brain do something it had not done in weeks. It woke up. The analytical part of him, the part that had been drowning in frustration and helplessness, suddenly surfaced and began asking questions. Something changed. Something external. These wounds did not heal on their own. Someone or something intervened. He pulled aside Conrad Brandt, who happened to be next in the sick call line. Through Corporal Strauss, Roy asked what had changed. Conrad hesitated. He looked toward the clinic door as if hoping someone would walk in and rescue him from the question. Then he looked at the floor, and then he looked at Roy Caldwell's face, at the genuine confusion and hope in the American medic's eyes, and he made a decision. He told the truth. Friedrich Lehmann has been treating the wounds at night with boiled salt water. It is working. Roy heard the words through Strauss's translation and felt three emotions collide inside his chest with such force that for a moment he could not identify any of them. Then they separated one by one like clouds breaking apart after a storm. The first was amazement, pure, unfiltered amazement. A 19-year-old prisoner with no medical training had solved a crisis that Roy, with 18 months of military medical education, had failed to solve. Using salt, table salt, the stuff that sat in every kitchen in America that cost pennies per pound, that Roy's mother kept in a ceramic jar on the counter next to the sugar bowl. Salt. The second emotion was shame. It rose from somewhere below his ribs, hot and uncomfortable. Roy Caldwell was trained for this. He had studied wound care and infection management in field medicine. He should have thought of saline. He should have known. Hypertonic saline was not some exotic treatment from the far side of medical knowledge. It was ancient. Roman military surgeons used it. Field medics in the First World War used it. Every textbook on wound care mentioned it somewhere in the early chapters before the sections on antibiotics in the pages that modern doctors skim past because they assumed they would always have antibiotics available. Roy had skimmed past those pages. And a boy who never went to medical school, a boy whose entire education in wound care consisted of 3 sentences from a grandmother in a Bavarian kitchen, had turned to those exact pages and found the answer. The third emotion took longer to surface. It came slowly like dawn light filling a room, and it was the one that surprised Roy most. Gratitude. Not the polite kind, not the kind you feel when someone holds a door, the deep kind, the kind that changes the shape of your chest when you breathe. Roy Caldwell was grateful because 23 men might keep their legs, because Dieter Voss might stand at his workbench, because someone had done the thing that Roy could not do, and the fact that the someone was a German prisoner of war instead of an American medic did not diminish the miracle. It amplified it. Roy asked to see Friedrich immediately, but Roy was not the first person to learn about Friedrich's midnight work. And he was not the person whose response would matter most in the next 48 hours. Because while Roy was reading wound charts in the clinic and feeling the collision of amazement and shame and gratitude, another report about Friedrich Lehmann had already been delivered. A report that described the saltwater treatment not as healing, but as unauthorized chemical experiments on prisoners. A report delivered with calm precision and strategic intent to the one American officer in Camp Concordia who was least likely to ask follow-up questions and most likely to act on regulation alone. That report was delivered by Otto Kessler, and it was delivered to Sergeant First Class Warren Briggs. Here is what happened. 3 nights earlier, on the night Friedrich expanded his treatment to 15 patients, a young prisoner named Helmut Ziegler had been watching from his bunk. Helmut was 18, the youngest man in Barracks 14. His father died at Stalingrad. In the absence of a father, Helmut attached himself to Kessler with the desperate loyalty of a boy who needed someone to follow. And Kessler, to his credit, treated the boy fairly. Extra bread when Helmut looked thin. Lessons in keeping boots clean and posture straight. The small kindnesses of a man who understood that a boy without a father will find a father, and it is better to be a good one than to let the role fall to someone worse. Helmut saw Friedrich treating wounds in the dark. He told Kessler the next morning, not to harm Friedrich, but because Helmut genuinely believed Friedrich was taking a dangerous risk, and he wanted Kessler to stop Friedrich before the Americans caught him and punished everyone in the barracks. Kessler listened, asked precise questions: how many prisoners, which prisoners, what time, what materials. Thanked Helmut, told him to say nothing. Then Kessler thought for a very long time, and then Kessler went to Briggs. Not to Caldwell, who would have been sympathetic, not to Whitmore, who would have investigated fairly, to Briggs, because Kessler had been watching the Americans as carefully as he watched his own men, and Kessler understood Warren Briggs the way a chess player understands the pieces on the board. Briggs was not cruel. Briggs was broken. His brother Danny, 19 years old, dead at Anzio. And every time Briggs looked at Friedrich Lehmann, tall and thin, with light eyes and quiet hands, he saw the ghost of a boy who would never come home. Briggs dealt with that ghost by turning everything into regulation. Rules, procedures, the cold comfort of a system that does not require feelings. Kessler told Briggs through Strauss that a prisoner named Friedrich Lehmann was conducting unauthorized chemical experiments on fellow prisoners during the night. He presented himself as a concerned senior prisoner worried about safety. He said Friedrich had no medical training and could be causing harm. He said he felt it was his duty to report this before someone was injured. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. Kessler did not say Friedrich was helping the Americans. He framed Friedrich as a danger. He turned an act of mercy into a potential crime, and he handed the weapon to the one man who would use it without asking what it was really made of. On the morning of the 5th day, while the prisoners were out on the farm detail, Briggs searched Barracks 14. He found the dented pot under Friedrich's bunk. He found cloth strips stiff with dried salt crystals. He found a small bag of salt hidden inside Friedrich's rucksack. When Friedrich returned from the fields that afternoon, Briggs was waiting at the barracks door. 2 armed guards behind him. In his hand, the dented pot. You are not a doctor. You have no authority to treat anyone. You may be causing harm. You are coming with me. Friedrich was taken to an isolation room, a small space barely larger than a closet separated from the general barracks. He was told to stay until the investigation was complete. Briggs filed a report documenting unauthorized medical activity and recommended disciplinary action. And now, for the first time in this story, Roy Caldwell faced the moment that would define who he really was. Roy heard about Friedrich's detention within the hour. He had been preparing to examine Friedrich himself to see the saltwater treatment firsthand to understand what this quiet prisoner had accomplished with a pot and a bag of table salt. Instead, he learned that Friedrich was locked in a room and Briggs was filing paperwork to have him punished. Roy went to Briggs. The conversation happened in the narrow hallway between the guard quarters and the administration building. 2 Americans facing each other under a bare light bulb that cast shadows on both their faces. The hallway was not wide enough for 2 men to pass without turning sideways. It felt to Roy like standing in a space that had been designed to make confrontation uncomfortable. Briggs, Roy said, his voice level, more controlled than he felt. If that prisoner is treating infected wounds with saline solution, it is medically sound. It could be the only thing keeping 23 men from losing their legs. Briggs looked at Roy with an expression that was not hostile, but was entirely closed. The face of a man who has made a decision and does not intend to unmake it. He is a prisoner. He performed unauthorized medical procedures. He used materials without permission. The regulations are clear. I have filed my report. Roy tried again. I am the camp medic. I do not have antibiotics. I have been failing these men for weeks. This prisoner may have found the answer that I could not find. Are we going to punish him for that? Briggs's jaw tightened. One small movement. But Roy saw it, and he understood what it meant. It meant Danny. It meant Anzio. It meant a 19-year-old brother who was never coming home, and a 19-year-old German prisoner who was still alive, in the unfairness of that equation which Briggs carried every single day like a stone in his chest that he could not put down and could not throw away. The regulations are clear, Briggs said again. He is a prisoner, not a doctor. End of discussion. Briggs walked away. Roy stood in the hallway and felt the familiar pull of his oldest habit. Accept it. Follow the rules. Write a strongly worded report. Use the word urgent in capital letters. And move on. Roy turned and walked toward the clinic. Past the door to Captain Whitmore's office. Kept walking. Got 3 steps past the door. And stopped. He stood in the hallway with his back to Whitmore's door and felt something happening inside his chest that was new and uncomfortable and absolutely necessary. The feeling of a man who has spent his entire life following rules, suddenly realizing that the rules are not enough. That following rules is easy. That the hard thing, the thing that separates a good man from a brave one, is knowing when the rules are wrong and having the courage to say so out loud to someone who has the power to change them. Roy thought about Dieter Voss and the baseball bat and the laugh that could fill a barracks. He thought about the words, "I need 2 legs to stand at my workbench." He thought about 23 men whose infections were finally healing because a 19-year-old boy remembered what his grandmother taught him about salt. And then Roy thought about Tommy. Tommy somewhere in the Pacific, wounded in a hospital. And if Tommy was lying on a cot right now with an infected wound, and if some medic in that hospital knew a way to help but was afraid to break the rules, would Roy want that medic to stay silent? Would Roy want that medic to walk past the captain's door and keep walking? Roy turned around. He walked back to Whitmore's door. He put his hand on the doorknob. He stood there for what felt like a very long time, but was probably less than a minute. His hand was sweating on the metal knob. His heart was beating in his ears. Then he knocked. That knock. 5 knuckles on a wooden door in a military clinic in Kansas. It was the smallest sound in the world, and it was the loudest thing Roy Caldwell had ever done. Whitmore opened the door. Pen in hand, already tapping. Captain Roy said, "I need to talk to you about a prisoner named Friedrich Lehman, and I need to tell you that Sergeant Briggs is wrong." Whitmore listened. He tapped his pen. He asked questions. Then he did what a doctor does when presented with a medical question. He examined the evidence. Over the next 48 hours, while Friedrich sat in his isolation room listening through thin walls for any word about Dieter's condition, unable to help, unable to even know whether his work was holding or whether the wounds were turning back toward the red, Whitmore personally examined every prisoner Friedrich had treated. He compared their wounds to prisoners with comparable infections who had not received the saltwater treatment. The results were unambiguous. Of the 23 prisoners Friedrich treated, 22 showed significant improvement. Infections resolving, swelling decreasing, no complications, no adverse effects. Of the 8 prisoners with comparable infections who had not been treated, 6 had worsened. 2 were now critical. Friedrich spent those 48 hours in a room barely larger than a closet, hearing fragments of conversation through the walls, unable to know whether Dieter's leg was healing or dying. It was the longest 2 days of his life, longer than the day he was captured, longer than the night he learned about his father, because in those other moments he had been powerless from the start. In this moment, he had the power to help and was being prevented from using it. Whitmore called Friedrich to the clinic. Through Strauss, he asked Friedrich to explain the entire process in detail. Friedrich described each step: boiling water to sterilize, dissolving salt to the concentration of tears, cooling to wrist temperature, soaking clean cloth, wrapping with firm but not tight pressure, changing twice daily. Whitmore recognized what Friedrich had created: a hypertonic saline solution. The salt concentration, higher than normal body fluids, generated osmotic pressure that drew infected fluid out of wound tissue while simultaneously dehydrating bacteria. The continuous contact maintained by soaked bandages kept the antimicrobial environment active for hours. This was not folk superstition. This was a medical technique with roots stretching back 2,000 years, used extensively before antibiotics existed, and somehow forgotten by a modern system that had grown so dependent on pharmaceutical solutions that it could not function without them. Whitmore wrote a sentence in his notebook that would later appear in his official report, a sentence that Roy Caldwell would repeat to every nursing student he trained for the next 30 years. Prisoner Lehman has independently preserved an ancient medical technique that our modern system forgot because we became dependent on solutions we do not have. Whitmore ordered Friedrich released from isolation. He further ordered that Friedrich continue the saltwater treatments under the direct supervision of Sergeant Roy Caldwell. Official, documented, approved. And then Whitmore did one more thing. He called Briggs into his office and informed him that the investigation was closed, that Friedrich's treatment was medically sound, that the matter was settled. Briggs stood at attention and said, "Yes, sir." His face showed nothing. But when he left Whitmore's office and passed Roy in the hallway, their eyes met for a single second. Roy expected anger. He expected coldness. What he saw instead was something he did not expect at all. Relief. It was there for only a moment, like a fish breaking the surface of still water and disappearing again. But Roy saw it. Warren Briggs, the man who turned everything into regulation because regulations did not require him to feel, looked relieved that someone else had made the decision, that the rules had been overridden by someone with more authority, that the 19-year-old German boy who looked like his dead brother was going to be allowed to keep healing people instead of sitting in a closet while legs rotted. Briggs never spoke about it. He never acknowledged what had happened. But from that day forward, when Friedrich moved through the camp carrying his pot of salt water and his strips of clean cloth, Briggs looked the other way. Not with hostility, not with warmth, with the deliberate unseeing of a man who has decided that some things are better left outside the boundaries of regulation. Friedrich walked out of the clinic carrying the weight of a complicated victory. The salt water had been vindicated. The treatment would continue. But inside Barracks 14, the cost was already accumulating. If you have been following this story and want to hear the full account of how Friedrich's healing created consequences that echoed across two families in 53 years, make sure to hit subscribe. These are the stories that the history books left out. Stories about ordinary people on both sides of the wire who discovered that courage does not care what language you speak. The next part of Roy Caldwell's story will test everything you think you know about loyalty, pride, and the true cost of mercy. Friedrich was now officially a collaborator. He did not wear the word on his uniform. There was no stamp, no mark, no formal designation. But inside Barracks 14, the word was written in the air as clearly as if it had been painted on the wall. Friedrich Lehmann cooperated with the Americans. His name appeared in American medical reports. His treatment methods were supervised by an American sergeant. He walked in and out of the American clinic carrying pots of salt water while 40 men watched and remembered. Kessler did not say a word. He did not need to. The barracks said it for him. And Kessler did not stop at Friedrich. He turned the silence on Dieter too. The man whose leg Friedrich saved, the man who still smiled and still told jokes and still tried to make the barracks feel less like a prison, was slowly erased from the social life of Barracks 14. Seats were taken when Dieter approached. Conversations ended when he sat down. The warmth that had always defined Dieter, that easy laugh, that restless energy that could not stand still for 30 seconds, began to dim. He spoke less. He sat alone more often. He still smiled, but the smile no longer reached his eyes. Friedrich watched this happen and felt something build inside him that was darker and hotter than anything he had felt before. Kessler was punishing Dieter for the crime of being saved, for the crime of gratitude, for the crime of still being loyal to the man who kept his legs. Friedrich ate alone. The spaces on either side of him at the mess table were always empty. Conversations stopped when he approached. Eyes turned away when he looked for contact. Conrad Brandt, who had helped Friedrich prepare the salt water that first night, who had stood beside him in the darkness and carried pots and cut bandages, now sat at the far end of the barracks and would not meet Friedrich's gaze. Kessler had spoken to Conrad privately. No one knew what was said. But Conrad's family was in Dresden, and Dresden was in Germany, and Germany was a place where Kessler's memory would matter long after the barbed wire was gone. But while Friedrich endured the silence of his own barracks, something else was growing. Something between Friedrich and Roy Caldwell that neither man had expected and neither man could have planned. They began working together every day. Roy handled the official documentation, the wound measurements, the reports to Whitmore. Friedrich handled the treatments. They communicated through Strauss, but increasingly through a simpler language. A nod when a wound looked good, a frown when something concerned them. The slight raising of eyebrows that means tell me more. The small shake of the head that means not yet, give it time. The language of two healers working the same problem from different sides. One afternoon, after a long morning of wound inspections, Roy brought Friedrich a bottle of Coca-Cola. Cold. Condensation running down the glass, ice clinking inside. Friedrich had never tasted Coca-Cola. He took the bottle, opened it, and drank. His eyes widened. The sweetness, the cold, the bubbles that bit the tongue like tiny electric sparks. In the mouth of a man who had been eating prisoner rations for over a year, the taste was more vivid than any food he could remember. Not better than Bavarian cooking, but more surprising, like discovering that the enemy's country had at least one thing worth knowing about. Friedrich said through Strauss, "In Bavaria we have beer. It is better." Roy laughed. "In Oklahoma, those are fighting words." Friedrich almost smiled. Strauss translated and then laughed himself. Three men from three different worlds sitting in a prison camp clinic in the middle of Kansas laughing over beer and Coca-Cola. Outside the window, the Kansas wheat moved in the wind, golden and indifferent to war. Roy told Friedrich about his farm in Oklahoma. Wheat and cattle, how the soil in eastern Oklahoma was red, not brown like Kansas, and how the wheat grew shorter but tasted the same. Friedrich nodded. Bavaria had wheat too, and cattle, and mornings that smelled like cut grass and bread baking, and the particular sweetness of manure that farmers recognize as the smell of honest work. Two farm boys. That was what they were underneath the uniforms. Two men who had grown up with dirt under their fingernails and wheat dust in their hair, and the knowledge that land does not care who owns it. The wheat grows regardless. The cattle eat regardless. The sun rises on Oklahoma and Bavaria with equal disinterest in the politics of nations. Roy asked about Friedrich's family. Through Strauss, Friedrich said his mother and sister were in Bavaria. His father was dead. He did not say how. Roy did not press. He said his own brother Tommy was somewhere in the Pacific, wounded, in a hospital. He had received a letter from his mother saying Tommy was alive but hurt, and the details were thin, and the silence since then was thick. Both men sat with the weight of not knowing, and neither said another word about it because some weights are too heavy for conversation and can only be carried in silence side by men who understand that carrying is sometimes the only thing you can do. Then Roy asked the question he had been wanting to ask since the first week he noticed Friedrich at the washing station. "Layman, why do you always wash your hands?" Friedrich looked at his hands, turned them over, looked at the lines in his palms as if reading something written there that only he could see. "My grandmother," Friedrich said through Strauss. "She said dirty hands carry the devil into every wound." Roy smiled. "My mother said dirty hands at the dinner table mean no dessert." Friedrich paused, then through Strauss. "Your mother and my grandmother would have gotten along very well." Roy laughed again, this time longer, this time real. "They would have terrified us both." For a few days they existed in a fragile peace. Salt water and shared laughter, and two farm boys who had found common ground on opposite sides of a barbed wire fence. Roy documented. Friedrich healed. Strauss translated. Wells brought Coca-Cola. The wounds improved. The charts showed progress. 22 of 23 prisoners were on the path to recovery. The lone exception, a 45-year-old man named Gustav, whose infection had reached the bone, was transferred to the military hospital, where antibiotics could reach what salt water could not. Friedrich was the one who told Caldwell that Gustav needed more help. "I cannot heal this with salt," he said through Strauss. "The infection is in the bone. The American doctors can help him. I will not pretend my grandmother's remedy can do everything. It cannot." Roy heard this and felt something shift in his understanding of Friedrich. The boy was not a miracle worker. He was not claiming to be. He knew exactly where his knowledge ended, and he was willing to say so out loud. That honesty, that willingness to acknowledge limitation, was the quality that earned Friedrich the trust of the American medical staff more than anything else. Roy had seen plenty of overconfidence in his training. Men who claimed to know more than they did. Friedrich was the opposite. He claimed less than he could deliver, and that humility made him credible. But peace in wartime is always borrowed time, and the interest was about to come due. Because back in Barracks 14, a man who had lost everything was about to lose the one thing he had left, his pride. And the infection that would bring Otto Kessler to his knees was already growing silently beneath the surface of his skin, feeding on the same dust and sweat and broken boot leather that had started everything. And when it surfaced, it would force Friedrich to make a choice that would cost more than salt and water. A choice between justice and mercy. Between the satisfaction of letting a proud man fall and the burden of catching him. That choice was 12 days away. and the clock once again was already running. Roy Caldwell noticed it on a Tuesday morning in early October. He was standing outside the clinic drinking coffee that was too weak and too hot, watching the prisoners file out for the farm detail. The Kansas air had turned. Not cold yet, but carrying the first cool edge of autumn, the kind of morning where you can smell the season changing, where the wheat fields have gone from gold to stubble, and the sky is that particular shade of pale blue that only exists in the middle of the country in the weeks before winter remembers where it left its coat. The prisoners walked past in their usual formation. Quiet, orderly, boots on hard ground. And Roy, who had spent the last 2 months watching men walk whose eyes had been trained by 23 infected legs to read the language of pain in the way a body moves, saw something that made his coffee stop halfway to his mouth. Otto Kessler was limping. It was subtle, almost undetectable. A slight favoring of the right leg, a fraction of a second longer on the left foot than the right, a brief tightening of the jaw that could have been concentration or fatigue or the morning cold or anything at all. But Roy had watched 23 men limp and shuffle and drag infected legs across this camp for 2 months. He knew the way a man walked when pain lived below the knee. He knew the way a man held his shoulders when he was compensating for a leg that could not carry its full share of weight. He knew the tiny involuntary signals that the body sends when it is losing a fight it does not want anyone to know about. And he saw those signals now in Kessler. Roy watched Kessler walk past the clinic and felt a cold recognition settle in his stomach. Not surprise, something worse than surprise. Certainty, the certainty of a medic who has seen the pattern too many times to mistake it. Kessler was infected. The same dust, the same boots, the same Kansas ground that had started everything was doing it again, this time to the one man in the camp who would rather lose his leg than ask for help from the people who could save it. Roy said nothing that morning. He watched, and he waited. And he did something he had not done since the crisis began. He started counting days. Over the next 7 days, Roy watched Kessler's body lose the war his pride refused to acknowledge. The stiffness in his right ankle became a limp. The limp became night sweats that soaked through Kessler's shirt, even though the October air had turned cool enough for blankets. The night sweats became a fever visible from across the yard, a flush in Kessler's face, and a glassiness in his eyes that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with a body burning fuel to fight something it could not see. On day 8, Roy sent Strauss to ask if the Feldwebel needed medical attention. Kessler's response came back cool and precise. He had bruised his foot on a rock. It was healing well. He did not require examination. Roy looked at Strauss. Strauss looked at Roy. Neither man believed it, but prisoners had the right to refuse medical examination. And Kessler was not a man who could be forced to do anything he had decided not to do. By day 10, the arithmetic of infection was doing its terrible math inside Roy's head. 10 days of untreated infection in a leg that was being walked on for 10 hours a day on hard Kansas ground was not a number that left room for optimism. Friedrich saw it too. Of course he did. Friedrich had spent 2 months studying infected legs the way a scholar studies ancient texts, learning their language, recognizing their stages, reading the story they told, in swelling and color and heat, and the particular way a man adjusts his weight when his body is betraying him. Friedrich counted the same days Roy counted. He read the same signals, and he arrived at the same conclusion. But Friedrich's conclusion carried a weight that Roy's did not, because Friedrich knew something that Roy could only guess at. He knew that Kessler was hiding the infection not out of ignorance but out of pride. Kessler knew what salt water could do. He had watched Friedrich heal 23 men. He had watched the wounds close and the swelling retreat and the men walk again. And he would rather rot than ask for help from the man he had called a traitor. Kessler was treating himself. Friedrich was certain of it. He could picture it with terrible clarity. Kessler at 4 a.m. alone in the washroom, wrapping his leg with cloth that had not been boiled, soaking it in water, that had not been properly salted, using the wrong materials in the wrong method, because the right method belonged to Friedrich, and asking Friedrich was a surrender that Kessler's pride would not permit. The man who created the silence law was being killed by his own silence. Friedrich lay in his bunk at night and stared at the ceiling and felt something he had felt once before in those 3 terrible days when Dieter was losing his leg and Friedrich was walking past the salt on the kitchen shelf. The weight of knowing, The paralysis of a man who has the answer and cannot bring himself to use it. But this time the paralysis was different. This time the man who needed help was the man who had tried to destroy Friedrich, the man who reported him to Briggs, the man who isolated Dieter, the man who turned 40 men against Friedrich for the crime of healing. And a voice inside Friedrich, a voice that was not his grandmother's, a voice that was darker and more tired and entirely his own, said something that was reasonable and cold. Let him fall. He chose this. Every step of it. He created the silence law that kept you from helping people sooner. He tried to have you punished. He turned your closest friend into a ghost. Let him live with the consequences of his pride. You owe him nothing. The voice was not wrong. That was the worst part. The voice was not wrong, and Friedrich knew it, and the knowing made the weight heavier instead of lighter, because being right about someone's suffering does not make the suffering less real. Day 12. The battle ended. It was morning. The wake-up bugle cut through the October air. Men rose dressed, prepared for the farm detail. Kessler did not move. He lay on his bunk with his eyes closed, face the color of old candle wax, sweat running down his temples in thin streams that caught the early light. His breathing was shallow and fast. Too fast. The breathing of a body that was running out of ways to fight. Helmut Ziegler reached him first. The boy shook Kessler's shoulder and called his name. Kessler opened his eyes but did not seem to recognize where he was. His lips moved. No words came. Helmut's face went white. He ran for the door, shouting for a guard. Roy Caldwell arrived within minutes. He had been in the clinic reviewing charts, drinking his morning coffee. He set the coffee down, grabbed his medical bag, and jogged across the yard to Barracks 14 with the focused urgency of a man who has been waiting for this moment and hoping it would not come. He knelt beside Kessler's bunk, pulled up the right pant leg, and drew a sharp breath through his teeth. The leg from ankle to knee was swollen to nearly twice its normal size. The skin was stretched tight enough to split dark red shading to purple in places radiating heat that Roy could feel without touching. A makeshift bandage fashioned from a torn undershirt was wrapped around the worst area, soaked through with fluid that was yellow and foul. The bandage had not been boiled. It had not been treated with salt. There was no medicine on it, no antiseptic, nothing but cloth and desperation and the stubborn refusal of a proud man to admit that he needed the help of a man he had wronged. Red streaks ran from Kessler's knee all the way to his groin, following the lymphatic channels, carrying infection toward the center of the body like rivers flowing toward a poison sea. Roy had seen this before in the worst of the 23 cases before Friedrich's saltwater turned the tide. But those men had been sick for days. Kessler had been sick for 12 days. 12 days of walking on it, working on it, hiding it, pretending it was a bruise, wrapping it in dirty cloth at 4 a.m, and hoping that discipline could defeat bacteria. Discipline cannot defeat bacteria. Bacteria do not care about the silence law. Roy called for Whitmore. The captain arrived, examined Kessler, and made his assessment in a voice that was professionally steady and personally shaken. Severe cellulitis with probable early sepsis. Fever of 40.2 degrees. Pulse rapid and weak. The infection had been building for nearly 2 weeks without proper treatment. The body was losing. Whitmore had 1 course of antibiotics remaining, 1 single course saved for a true emergency. He administered the first dose by injection, but 1 course might not be enough. The infection was extensive. The antibiotics would slow the advance, perhaps stop it, but they could not reverse the damage already done to tissue that had been swelling and dying for 12 days. The military hospital was 200 miles away. Transport could be arranged, but the process took days. Whitmore stood in the clinic, tapped his pen. The sound filled the small room like a heartbeat counting down. Then he looked at Roy. Roy looked at Whitmore. The same look they had shared weeks ago when 23 men were losing their legs and there was no medicine and no solution. Except now there was a solution. It was standing 40 yards away in a barracks holding a pot and a bag of salt. Hypertonic saline bandages, Whitmore said. Combined with the antibiotics, it is his best chance. Roy nodded. I will get Lehman. Roy found Friedrich on the farm detail, hauling wheat under a pale autumn sky. The wind was cold now, carrying the smell of turned earth and dying grass and the distant, clean scent of the first frost that had not yet arrived but was coming. Roy walked up to Friedrich and said through Strauss 4 words that carried the weight of everything that had happened between them over the past 2 months. Kessler is infected badly. I need you. Friedrich stood in the middle of the Kansas wheat field. The wind pulled at his thin prisoner uniform. The autumn sun was low and pale and cast his shadow long across the stubble. And Roy watched Friedrich's face and saw something he would never forget. A war, not a metaphor. An actual war fought across the landscape of a 19-year-old face in the space of perhaps 10 seconds. Roy could read it the way he read wound charts, the way he read the signals of pain in a man's walk. He saw the anger first, brief and hot, flashing across Friedrich's eyes like lightning. Then something darker. The cold, tired satisfaction of a man who has been wronged and is being offered the chance to watch his wronger suffer. Then grief. Old grief that had nothing to do with Kessler, grief that belonged to a father dying in Russia and a grandmother dying in Bavaria, and a boy who had learned that the world does not distribute justice evenly. And then last, something that Roy recognized because he had felt it himself standing outside Whitmore's door with his hand on the doorknob 3 steps past the point of walking away. Resolution. Friedrich looked at Roy. His voice was quiet, steady, clear. I need salt, boiling water, clean cloth, in half an hour. The clinic was small and bright. The overhead light made everything look sharp and slightly too real, the way hospital light always does, stripping away shadows and softness until only the truth remains. Kessler lay on the examination table. The antibiotic injection was already working through his bloodstream, a single soldier facing an army that had been building its forces for 12 days. Friedrich entered carrying a pot of freshly prepared salt water. Steam rose from the surface in thin white curls. The smell of salt filled the room sharp and clean against the heavy, sweet, wrong smell of advanced infection. Kessler opened his eyes. Roy stood by the wall watching, and what he saw in the next 5 seconds taught him more about the human heart than 18 months of medical training. Kessler's gaze found Friedrich's face, and Roy saw shame. Not the small kind, not embarrassment. The deep structural shame of a proud man lying helpless before the person he had wronged most. A man who had built walls and enforced silence and punished mercy, now unable to stand, unable to fight, unable to do anything except lie on a table and watch the man he tried to destroy walk toward him with a pot of salt water and clean bandages. Kessler turned his face away. Friedrich said nothing. He set the pot on the table beside Kessler's leg. He sat down on the metal stool. He began to work. Roy watched Friedrich's hands. He had watched these hands before during the weeks of supervised treatment, and he had always been impressed by their steadiness and precision. But this was different. This was Friedrich treating the man who had reported him isolated, him punished his best friend, and tried to have him locked in a closet. And Friedrich's hands did not shake, did not hesitate, did not move with anything less than the full, careful attention that Roy had seen him give to every wound he had ever touched. Friedrich dipped cloth into salt water, laid it against Kessler's wound. Kessler's entire body tensed. A sound escaped through clenched teeth. His hands gripped the edges of the table until his knuckles turned white. Friedrich wrapped the cloth with movements that were slow, precise, and gentle. Layer over layer, firm but not tight. The way his grandmother had wrapped his leg when he was 9 years old in a kitchen in Bavaria that no longer existed in any form except memory and the knowledge it had produced. When Friedrich finished, he straightened up and spoke. His voice was quiet, without anger, without triumph, without pity. I will change the bandages at midnight and again at dawn. Salt water does not ask who deserves healing, Feldwebel. Friedrich stood and walked out of the clinic. Roy followed him into the hallway. Friedrich stopped, leaned his back against the wall, closed his eyes, let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep below his ribs, from a place where tension had been stored so long that releasing it felt like setting down a weight he had forgotten he was carrying. Roy stood beside him. He did not say anything. He did not need to. 2 farm boys, 2 sides of a war, standing in a hallway in a military clinic in the middle of Kansas, in the middle of a war that had nothing to do with either of them and everything to do with both of them. The silence between them said what words could not. It said, I understand. It said, I saw what that cost you. It said, the thing you just did is the bravest thing I have ever witnessed, and I have been watching men try to be brave since the day this war started. Friedrich changed Kessler's bandages that night at midnight, and again at dawn, and again at noon. and again at midnight. For 5 days, he maintained the schedule with the same methodical discipline that Kessler himself would have demanded. Boil. Dissolve, cool, soak, wrap, wait, repeat. The antibiotics fought from inside, the salt water fought from outside. Two forces, one modern and one ancient, working together against an enemy that did not care about pride or honor or rules or the complicated history between the man on the table and the man holding the cloth. Roy documented every change. His notes from those 5 days would later be included in Whitmore's official report. Day 2, fever decreased by 1 degree, patient more alert. Day 3, swelling measurably reduced, discoloration fading from purple toward red toward pink, lymphatic streaking no longer advancing. Day 4, patient able to sit up and eat solid food, eyes clearer. Day 5, wound drainage resolved, healthy tissue visible at wound margins, characteristic odor of infection replaced by mineral scent of saline treatment. During all 5 days of treatment, Kessler did not speak to Friedrich. Not one word. Friedrich arrived unwrapped, cleaned, applied fresh compresses, rewrapped, and seffed. The only sounds were the soft splash of cloth and salt water, and the occasional hiss of breath through Kessler's teeth when salt met raw tissue. Roy noticed something during those 5 days. Friedrich never spoke to Kessler except to give brief medical instructions through Strauss. Turn slightly. Hold still. This will sting. But the way Friedrich handled Kessler's leg, the gentleness, the patience, the careful attention to pressure and temperature and coverage, that was a language that did not need translation. And Kessler, who was fluent in discipline and control and the suppression of feeling, could not have missed what those hands were saying. On the 6th morning, something changed. Friedrich was unwrapping the bandage, working with his usual concentration, when Kessler spoke. His voice was rough, damaged by fever and disuse, but clear. Layman. Friedrich's hands paused on the bandage. Joe Feldwebel. A silence long enough for Roy, standing near the door, to hear his own heartbeat. Your grandmother, she taught you well. Roy watched Friedrich's face. He saw a small movement, not a smile, not relief, something more subtle. The slight relaxation of muscles that had been held tight for a very long time. The letting go that happens not when a war is won, but when a man realizes that the war is finally truly over. Friedrich did not answer with words. He finished the bandage, adjusted it carefully, and stood up. And Roy saw something that he would describe to his nursing students for the next 30 years, always at the same point in the lecture, always in the same quiet voice, as the moment when he understood that medicine is not just chemistry and biology and the mechanics of tissue repair. Medicine is the decision to heal someone who has hurt you. That is where medicine becomes something more than science. That is where it becomes grace. Kessler recovered. He walked again within 2 weeks. His leg bore a scar that he would carry for the rest of his life, a twisted ridge of tissue from ankle to calf, the permanent record of what pride almost cost him. And then 3 weeks after Kessler's recovery, 2 things happened that changed the temperature of everything. The first was a letter. It arrived on a cool October afternoon, delivered by the International Red Cross, delayed 14 months in transit, addressed to Feldwebel Otto Kessler. The letter had been written by Ilse Kessler from a farmhouse in Schleswig-Holstein, in handwriting that slanted slightly to the right, the way it always had, the way Kessler had seen it on grocery lists and birthday cards, and the note she left on his pillow the morning he shipped out for Africa. Kessler took the letter to his bunk, sat down, opened it, read it. Roy was in the clinic when he heard. Strauss told him. Kessler received a letter from his wife. She is alive. His daughter is alive. They survived Hamburg. Roy put down the chart he was holding and sat very still for a moment. He thought about Tommy, about the months of silence, about the letter from his mother that said Tommy was wounded but alive, about the weight that lifted when he read those words. And he understood, across the gulf of language and nationality and everything else that separated him from Otto Kessler, exactly what that letter meant. Because the relief of knowing is universal. It does not require translation. When Kessler turned around from reading the letter and stood up, something was different. Not in his posture, which remained straight, not in his expression, which remained controlled, but in his eyes. Something that had been clenched for 14 months had released. Like a fist held so long the fingers had forgotten how to open now, uncurling slowly, painfully, but uncurling. The second thing happened 3 days later. A group of prisoners newly transferred from another camp arrived at Concordia. Among them were several men who had heard about Friedrich Lehmann, not the healing, the collaboration. In the network of German prisoner camps across Kansas and Oklahoma, word traveled through new arrivals and transferred prisoners, the way water travels through cracks in rock, finding every opening, reaching every corner. And the word about Friedrich was not kind. 5 of these men came to Barracks 14 on an evening when the October sun was setting behind the Kansas wheat stubble, and the sky was the color of old copper. Friedrich was outside the barracks preparing salt water on the small stove for the evening treatment round. Steam rose from the pot, the mineral smell of heated salt drifted across the yard. Friedrich was focused on his work testing the temperature against his wrist the way Hedwig had taught him, and he did not see the men approaching until they were standing in a half circle in front of him. They did not shout, they did not threaten. They simply stood there. 5 men with hard faces and the cold, certain eyes of people who believe they are defending something important. One of them spoke in German, his voice level and precise. Friedrich did not need Strauss to translate. He understood every word. Collaborator, traitor. When Germany rebuilds, men like you will be remembered. Your family will be remembered. Friedrich looked up from his pot, salt water dripping from his hands, steam rising between him and the 5 men like a thin, fragile wall. He did not speak. He did not move. He stood there holding a pot of salt water and felt the word traitor land on him like a stone thrown from close range. Roy was in the clinic 30 yards away. He saw the men through the window, saw Friedrich standing alone, saw the body language, the half circle, the posture of confrontation. He set down his pen and started for the door. But before Roy reached the yard, someone else moved first. Otto Kessler stepped out of Barracks 14. He walked slowly. His right leg still carried the limp that would never fully disappear, the scar pulling slightly, with each step a permanent reminder written in flesh. He walked past the rows of bunks, past the watching eyes of 40 men, past the doorway and into the October evening, where 5 strangers stood in judgment over the man who had saved his life. Kessler positioned himself between Friedrich and the 5 men. He did not square his shoulders. He did not raise his voice. He stood the way he had always stood, straight and controlled, with the authority of a man who has earned the right to be heard, not through rank but through survival. He spoke in German, quiet, measured, each word placed with the precision of a man who has thought carefully about what he wants to say and will not waste a single syllable. This man healed 23 soldiers. He healed me with salt and water and his grandmother's knowledge. That is not betrayal. Betrayal is letting a man die when you have the power to save him. I know this, because I almost did. The silence that followed was the kind that changes rooms, the kind that rearranges the furniture of understanding. The 5 men looked at Kessler, looked at the scar visible below his rolled trouser leg, looked at Friedrich standing behind Kessler with a pot of salt water in his hands and an expression of pure, unguarded surprise on his face. The men turned and walked away. No one spoke. There was nothing to speak about. Kessler had said everything, and the scar on his leg had confirmed it. Roy Caldwell stood at the clinic door 30 yards away and watched the whole thing. He did not speak German. He did not understand the words. But Roy Caldwell was a man who had spent his entire life reading bodies, reading the language of pain in the way a man walks, reading the language of healing in the way a wound closes. And now he read the language of redemption in the way a proud man stood between a healer and his accusers and said with his body and his scar and his voice, I was wrong. He was right, and I will not let this happen again. Roy stood at the door and felt something rise in his chest that was too large for the moment and too important to ignore. He was watching. He realized the thing that medicine could not do. Salt water healed wounds on the skin. Antibiotics healed infections in the blood. But what Kessler had just done, standing in the October light with his scarred leg and his quiet voice, healed something deeper. Something that lived in the space between people, in the invisible tissue that connects one human being to another and tears when trust is broken and mends only when someone is brave enough to stand in the gap. Roy would tell this story to his nursing students for 30 years, always at the end of the first lecture, always in the same quiet voice. He would say, I watched a German soldier stand up for the man he had tried to destroy. And I understood that healing is not just what happens to the body. Healing is what happens when someone decides that mercy matters more than pride. That is the lesson no textbook can teach you. That is the lesson a 19-year-old boy with a pot of salt water taught me in the middle of Kansas in 1944. And I have never forgotten it. If this story has moved, you share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is the time. Because the ending of this story is something you will carry with you long after this video is over. These are the stories that the history books left out. And we are not done yet. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The news reached Camp Concordia on a warm spring evening when the Kansas wheat was just beginning to turn green in the fields. The prisoners received the news in silence. No celebration, no tears, only the strange, hollow feeling of men who had been waiting for something for so long that the arrival of it felt less like relief and more like the sudden absence of a weight they had grown accustomed to carrying. Roy stood in the clinic and listened to the radio announcement and thought about Tommy. Tommy was alive. He had lost 3 fingers on his left hand to shrapnel on some island Roy still could not pronounce, but he was alive and coming home to Oklahoma. Roy had received that letter 2 months ago, and he had read it 17 times, and each time the words were the same, and each time the relief was new. 22 of the 23 men Friedrich treated kept both legs. Gustav, the man whose infection reached the bone, recovered fully at the military hospital, and returned to Camp Concordia walking on his own. 0 deaths, 0 amputations, 0 cases of sepsis. Total cost of treatment less than $2 in salt water and cloth. Captain Whitmore completed his official report. The document was circulated to camp medical officers across Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. By the end of 1944, an estimated 50 to 70 prisoner of war camps had adopted some version of Friedrich's saline treatment protocol. The number of men who benefited was impossible to calculate precisely, but medical officers across the region reported significant reductions in serious wound complications during the months that followed. 50 to 70 camps. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of men who kept their limbs because a boy in Barracks 14 remembered what his grandmother told him in a kitchen in Bavaria. The ripple that began with a pot of salt water on a Kansas night spread outward in circles that Friedrich could not see and would not fully understand for decades. The repatriation process took months. Friedrich continued working in the clinic through the end of 1945, treating new cases, training other prisoners as barracks health monitors, assisting Roy with daily operations. They worked side by side through the summer and autumn and into the winter. 2 men who had started as enemies and become something that neither of them had a word for. Not friends exactly. The word was too small. Not brothers. The word was too familiar. Something between and beyond. 2 men who had seen each other clearly in the moments that mattered most and recognized something worth knowing. In early 1946, Friedrich's repatriation was approved. On his last day at Camp Concordia, Friedrich packed his few belongings and walked to the clinic. Roy was there sitting at his desk pretending to read a chart that he had already read 3 times. The pretending was obvious. Roy was not good at pretending. He was good at being direct and honest and present, and the effort of appearing casual when he was anything but casual showed in the way he held the chart slightly too tight at a slightly wrong angle. Friedrich stood in the doorway. Roy looked up. For a moment, neither man spoke. The clinic was quiet. The radio was off. The overhead light hummed the way it always did, a sound so constant that both men had stopped hearing it months ago. Roy reached into his desk drawer and took out a small package wrapped in cloth. He handed it to Friedrich. "Open it when you get home," Roy said through Strauss. Friedrich took the package. It was light. He could feel something smooth and hard inside the wrapping. A jar. Roy stood and extended his hand. Friedrich shook it. Roy's grip was firm and warm and lasted longer than regulations required. Considerably longer. The kind of handshake that is not a greeting or a farewell, but a transfer. A passing of something invisible from one hand to another. Trust. Respect. The acknowledgement that what they had built together in this clinic with salt water and wound charts and weak coffee and Coca-Cola and the slow, difficult process of seeing a human being where an enemy is supposed to be was worth holding on to, Fritz Roy said. And it was the first time the American had used Friedrich's familiar name. "You taught me that the simplest answer is usually the best one. I will not forget that. Not ever." Friedrich wanted to say things about the Coca-Cola that was the first American thing he ever tasted, about the language they built from nods and frowns and half smiles, about how an Oklahoma farm boy who called every patient son had shown him that kindness does not need a shared language or a shared flag or a shared anything except the willingness to see another person's pain and decide that it matters. But the words were too large for the moment, and the moment was too fragile for words. Friedrich nodded. He held the package against his chest, and he walked out of the clinic and toward the camp gate. Briggs was standing by the gate, not blocking it, not greeting, just standing there the way he always stood, straight and still, and contained a man who had turned regulation into armor and wore it every day. Friedrich walked past him, and as he did, Briggs raised his hand to the brim of his cap, a small movement, quick, almost invisible, the kind of salute that a man gives when he does not want anyone to see him giving it, but cannot stop himself from giving it anyway. Friedrich looked back. Briggs had already turned away. Friedrich walked out of Camp Concordia and into the uncertain future of a defeated soldier going home to a country that had been turned inside out. He carried the package across the Atlantic on a crowded transport ship. He carried it through the repatriation center at Bremerhaven. He carried it on a train through a Germany that looked like a country that had been picked up and dropped from a great height, cities cracked open, bridges, missing fields, scarred with tank tracks and bomb craters. He carried it home to Bavaria. His mother was standing at the door of the farmhouse, thinner than he remembered, older by more than the years that had passed. But her arms were the same arms, and when she pulled Friedrich close, she smelled like bread and wood smoke, and the herbs that grew in the garden that Hedwig had planted decades ago. The garden was still there. The herbs were still growing. Some things survive everything. His sister, now 16, stood behind their mother and stared at Friedrich as if he were a stranger who happened to share a face with someone she once knew. Then the strangeness broke and she ran to him and held on with the desperate strength of someone who has learned that people can leave and not come back, and holding on is the only defense against a world that takes things away. Friedrich did not open the package that day. There was too much to do. The farmhouse needed repairs. The fields needed planting. The life that war had interrupted needed to be rebuilt board by board, seed by seed, the way everything worth having is built. It was a winter evening in 1947 when Friedrich finally sat down by the wood stove in the kitchen and opened Roy Caldwell's package. The kitchen was the same kitchen. The stove had been mended twice, but it was the same stove. The chair was the same chair, patched at the joints, worn smooth on the armrests. Outside, snow fell on the Bavarian hills with the patience of something that has been falling for 1,000 years and intends to continue. The window was dark. The fire crackled. The kitchen smelled like wood smoke and bread and dried herbs. The smell of Hedwig's kitchen, preserved in the walls, in the floorboards, the way some things are preserved in salt. Friedrich unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a small glass jar with a metal screw lid. The jar was filled with white crystals. Salt, ordinary table salt, the kind that sits on every kitchen shelf in every country on earth. The simplest substance, the most common mineral, the thing that has preserved meat and healed wounds and flavored bread since before recorded history. On the jar, in handwriting that was careful and clear and unmistakably American, were 6 words and a name. Simple Works. Do not forget your grandmother. Roy Caldwell, Oklahoma. Friedrich sat in the chair by the stove in the kitchen where everything began. He held the jar. He read the words. He read them again. And then the tears came. Not grief, not relief, something that contained both and went beyond both. The tears of a man holding physical proof that what he did mattered, that the knowledge his grandmother placed in his hands traveled across the world and saved lives and earned the respect of a man who started as his enemy and ended as something the word friend is too small to contain. That a medic in Oklahoma had gone to a post office in Kansas and mailed a jar of salt across an ocean to a village in Bavaria because 6 words in a jar of salt were the truest, simplest way to say everything that needed to be said. Friedrich placed the jar on the mantelpiece, next to a photograph of Hedwig. It would sit there for the rest of his life. Roy Caldwell returned to Oklahoma after the war and worked as a civilian nurse for 30 years. He trained hundreds of nurses, and every single one of them heard the story of Friedrich Lehman on their first day. Roy began every introductory lecture the same way. He stood at the front of the room, held up a small bag of table salt, and said, "The best teacher I ever had was a 19-year-old German prisoner of war who saved 23 men with saltwater clean cloth in the knowledge his grandmother gave him in a kitchen in Bavaria. He did it without antibiotics. He did it without a medical degree. He did it without permission. And he did it for the man who tried to destroy him. If you remember nothing else from this course, remember that. The simplest answer is usually the best one. And mercy is never wasted, not even on people who do not deserve it, especially not on them. Hundreds of nurses, thousands of patients, decades of better care, all of it traced back, whether anyone knew it or not, to a pot of salt water on a Kansas night. Roy kept his own jar of salt on the kitchen shelf of his farmhouse outside Tulsa. On the jar in his own handwriting were 5 words and a name: Fritz Camp Concordia, 1944. Simple works. His son James grew up seeing that jar every day, hearing the story every year, carrying it inside him the way children carry the stories their fathers tell, not as history, but as identity. Friedrich pursued medicine. He studied borrowed textbooks for 2 years while working odd jobs and repairing the farm. In 1948, he entered a nursing training program in Munich for returning veterans. He graduated in 1950. He worked at a hospital for 5 years, then returned to his village and opened a small clinic, the Village Healer. The role that Hedwig had held for decades now filled by her grandson, who kept a jar of salt on the clinic shelf and reached for it first before anything else every time a patient came in with an infected wound. He practiced medicine for 30 years. He told every young nurse he trained about his grandmother, about salt takes away the bad. He did not tell them about Camp Concordia or Kessler or the nights on the barracks floor. Those stories he kept for himself. And for Dieter, who visited every few years from Heidelberg, where he ran a successful carpentry workshop, standing on both legs behind a workbench building furniture with hands that were steady and strong. The table he built for his mother was finished in 1947. He built it with both feet on the floor, and every time he stood at that bench, he thought of Friedrich. Kessler went home to Hamburg and found Ilse and Lotte waiting. Lotte was 8 years old by then and did not recognize her father at first. It took 3 days before she would sit on his lap. It took 3 months before Kessler could sleep through the night without waking in a sweat, reaching for a photograph that was no longer needed because the people in it were real and breathing in the next room. He lived quietly. He never spoke about the war. But on summer evenings when the light was long and golden, he sometimes rolled up his right trouser leg and looked at the scar that ran from his ankle to his calf. And when Ilse asked what he was thinking, he always said the same thing, that he owed that scar to a boy who chose mercy when he had every reason to choose silence, and that the debt was one he could never fully repay. Now we come to the moment that connects everything. The moment that Roy Caldwell, dying in his Oklahoma farmhouse in 1989, was trying to tell his son James about when his voice gave out and the story remained unfinished. The moment that James Caldwell carried with him for the next 8 years, along with a jar of salt and an unanswered question. In 1997, James Caldwell traveled to Munich. He was 56 years old, gray-haired, large, with the weathered face of a man who had spent most of his life outdoors like his father and his father's father, Oklahoma men who measured the world in acres and rainfall and the particular quality of light at 6 in the morning when the wheat is wet with dew. James was not a farmer. He worked in agricultural supply. But the farm was in his blood, the way salt was in the jar on his kitchen shelf, fundamental and impossible to remove. James did not go to Munich as a tourist. He went to find Friedrich Lehmann. His father had always said he wanted to go back to Germany and find Fritz. Roy never made it. The heart that had kept beating through a war and 30 years of nursing gave out before it could carry him across an ocean. So James went instead, because sons finish the journeys their fathers begin. That is what sons are for. The pneumonia was an accident. James caught it on the plane or in the hotel or somewhere in between. The kind of pneumonia that ambushes healthy men in unfamiliar climates and lays them flat in foreign hospital beds surrounded by machines that beep in the same language everywhere, and doctors who speak in languages that are not your own. James checked into the university hospital in Munich and asked for a doctor who spoke English. The chart was routed accordingly. Dr. Marin Lehman picked up the chart during the evening shift. She was 28 years old, dark-haired, quick hands. The kind of doctor who reads a chart the way her grandfather read wounds, seeing not just the data, but the person behind it. She had grown up listening to Friedrich's stories beside the wood stove in the Bavarian kitchen. She knew about Hedwig and the salt water. She knew about Camp Concordia, though her grandfather spoke of it rarely, and always with a quietness that told her the memories were heavy enough to require silence as a counterweight. She chose medicine because of him. Because of the way he described healing as a conversation between knowledge and compassion. Because of the jar on the mantelpiece that he sometimes held in his hands on winter evenings, turning it in the light, reading words written in English by a man he had known for less than a year and remembered for a lifetime. Marin opened the chart. Read the patient name. James Caldwell. She stopped. Read it again. Set the chart down on the nurse's station and stood very still for a moment, the way her grandfather sometimes stood, when a memory surfaced as if the present needed a moment of silence to make room for the past. She walked to room 412, opened the door. James Caldwell was sitting up in bed, looking uncomfortable the way large men look uncomfortable in hospital beds that were designed for average-sized people. He smiled when Marin entered, the easy automatic smile of a man accustomed to being friendly with strangers. Marin introduced herself. Then she asked a question that she already knew the answer to but needed to hear spoken aloud. "Mr. Caldwell, are you related to Roy Caldwell from Oklahoma?" James's smile changed, surprise first, then curiosity, then the slow dawn of something that was not quite recognition and not quite disbelief, but lived in the space between both. "That was my father. He passed away in '89. "How do you know his name?" Marin said 5 words. "My grandfather is Friedrich Lehmann." The room went very quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when time folds in on itself and two parallel lines that have been running side by side for 53 years suddenly converge in a hospital room in Munich on an ordinary Tuesday evening. The monitors beeped. The hallway sounds continued. But inside room 412, the world had paused to make room for something it had not expected. James Caldwell stared at Marin Lehman. Then he reached for his bag on the bedside table, opened it, took out an object wrapped in a faded handkerchief, unwrapped it with the careful hands of a man handling something sacred. A small glass jar with a metal screw lid, slightly rusted, filled with white crystals. On the glass in handwriting that had faded but remained legible, 5 words and a name. Fritz Camp Concordia, 1944. Simple works. "My father kept this on the kitchen shelf for 45 years, James said. His voice was not entirely steady. "When he died, I kept it. He always said he wanted to come back to Germany and find Fritz. He never made it. So I came instead." Marin called her grandfather that evening. Friedrich was 72, still sharp, still walking to the village every morning for bread, still keeping the other jar of salt on the mantelpiece next to Hedwig's photograph. She told him about James Caldwell, about the jar, about room 412. Friedrich was silent on the telephone for a long time. The kind of silence that is not empty but full, filled with 53 years of memory pressing against the present, demanding to be felt. "Tell him," Friedrich finally said, "that the salt is still on the shelf." The following weekend, after James's pneumonia had cleared enough for travel, Marin drove him from Munich to the village in Bavaria. The road wound through hills that were green with late spring, past farmhouses and church steeples and fields where cattle stood in grass that reached their knees. James sat in the passenger seat and watched the countryside pass and thought about his father, about the story he had heard every year of his life, about the 19-year-old German prisoner who saved 23 men with salt and water, about how his father's voice always changed when he told the story, becoming quieter and steadier, the way a voice does when it is carrying something precious and does not want to drop it. Friedrich was waiting at the door of the farmhouse. He was smaller than James had imagined from his father's stories, smaller and older and quieter. But his eyes were sharp, and his hands, when he extended them for the handshake, were strong and steady and dry. The hands of a man who had spent his life working, healing, holding things together. James looked at Friedrich and saw the boss his father had described. Not the old man standing in front of him, but the 19-year-old who knelt on a barracks floor at 3 in the morning with a pot of salt water and the courage to do what needed doing when doing it could cost everything. James saw that boy because his father had kept that boy alive for 45 years, in a story, in a jar of salt, and now the boy and the old man existed simultaneously in the same face the way they do in every face that has lived long enough to contain both. Friedrich led James into the kitchen. The same kitchen, the same stove converted from wood to gas, the same window looking out at the same hills. And on the mantelpiece, beside a faded photograph of a woman with kind eyes and strong hands, sat a small glass jar with a metal screw lid. James set his jar beside it. 2 jars of salt, identical in size, identical in content, written on in the same handwriting faded by the same decades. One had traveled from Kansas to Bavaria in 1946. The other had traveled from Oklahoma to Munich in 1997. They had been separated by an ocean and half a century, and now they stood side by side on a wooden mantelpiece in a Bavarian kitchen, while spring light moved across the floor, and 2 men who had never met sat down to finish a conversation that their fathers had started 53 years ago. Friedrich looked at the 2 jars for a long time. Then he spoke in German and Maren translated. My grandmother said salt takes away the bad. Water carries the bad away. She was right about both. But she forgot to say one more thing. Salt also keeps the good in, it preserves, it keeps meat from spoiling, memories from fading, mercy from dying. That is what these jars are. Not salt, preserved mercy, kept alive across 53 years by 2 families who never forgot what happened on a barracks floor in the middle of the night. James told Friedrich what Roy had done with the story, how every nursing class for 30 years started with Friedrich Lehmann, how Roy held up a bag of salt on the first day and said the best teacher I ever had was a 19-year-old German prisoner of war, how hundreds of nurses heard the story and carried it into thousands of hospital rooms and clinics in emergency wards, and how every patient those nurses treated was connected, whether they knew it or not, to a boy in Bavaria whose grandmother taught him that salt takes away the bad. Friedrich listened. He nodded. He poured coffee that was much better than the coffee Roy had given him in the Camp Concordia clinic. And James laughed and said, my father always said your coffee was terrible, and Friedrich said, through Maren, his Coca-Cola was worse. And they both laughed. The sound filled the kitchen the way Dieter's laugh used to fill Barracks 14, warm and real and full of the particular joy that comes from finding connection in the most unlikely places. They talked through the afternoon about Roy and Friedrich, about Oklahoma, wheat and Bavarian wheat, about the farm details and the baseball game, and the Coca-Cola and the night sweats, and the salt water, and the scar on Kessler's leg, and the silence in the hallway and the jar on the shelf. About Dieter, who was still alive, still building furniture in Heidelberg, still standing on both legs. About Hedwig, who had been gone for 55 years and whose 3 sentences had traveled farther than she ever did. When it was time to leave, Friedrich walked James to the car. They shook hands. Friedrich held on for a moment longer than necessary. Then he said in English that was accented and careful and clearly practiced for a meeting he had spent 53 years believing would never happen, 5 words. Tell your father. Simple works. James Caldwell drove away down the dirt road with tears on his face and a story that he would tell for the rest of his life. Friedrich Lehmann stood at the door of his farmhouse and watched the car disappear around the bend in the road. The spring air smelled of cut grass and turned earth and the faint sweetness of apple blossoms from the orchard next door. The 2 jars of salt stood on the mantelpiece inside side by side, catching the last light of the afternoon through the kitchen window. Friedrich went inside and sat down in the chair by the stove. The same chair, the same stove, the same kitchen where a woman named Hedwig once boiled water and dissolved salt and wrapped a 9-year-old boy's leg and said 3 sentences that would save 23 lives and change military medicine and connect 2 families across an ocean for more than half a century. Salt takes away the bad, water carries the bad away, cloth keeps the good in. In 1944, a young American medic named Roy Caldwell stood in a clinic in Kansas with no medicine, no antibiotics, and 23 men losing their legs. He had every reason to accept the situation. He had followed the rules. He had filed the requests. He had done everything right, and it was not enough. Then a 19-year-old German prisoner walked in and said, I can help. I need salt. Roy could have said no. The regulations said no. The system said no. Every rule he had been trained to follow said no. But Roy thought about his brother Tommy, in a hospital in the Pacific, and he thought about Dieter Voss saying, "I need two legs to stand at my workbench," and he walked back to a door he had already passed, and he knocked. That knock opened a door that never closed. 23 men kept their legs. 50 to 70 camps adopted the treatment. Hundreds of nurses learned the story. Thousands of patients received better care. Two families were connected across an ocean for 53 years. A grandmother's knowledge spoken in a warm kitchen in Bavaria traveled around the world and came home again in a glass jar with 6 words written on it in a stranger's handwriting that was no longer a stranger's handwriting at all. Simple works. Do not forget your grandmother. The salt water was never just salt water. It was wisdom passed from hand to hand across generations. It was a grandmother teaching a grandson teaching a medic teaching hundreds of nurses. It was the oldest lesson in the world dressed in the simplest clothes doing the hardest work. Heal, even when it is difficult, even when the rules say stop, even when the person who needs your help is the person who hurt you most. Heal anyway, because salt does not ask who deserves healing. Water does not ask who deserves to be carried clean. And mercy once given does not stop at the person who receives it. It travels. It ripples. It crosses oceans and decades in the spaces between enemies and arrives 53 years later in a glass jar on a mantelpiece in a kitchen in Bavaria, where two families sit together and drink coffee and laugh about beer and Coca-Cola and discover that the distance between Oklahoma and Bavaria is not as far as it looks on a map. Not when you carry salt. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want more untold stories from the greatest generations, stories about ordinary Americans who chose mercy when the world chose war, subscribe to this channel. We will keep finding these stories. We will keep telling them. Because stories like this one are too important to stay buried. They deserve to live. The way salt preserves. The way water carries. The way cloth holds the good in. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering.